So our next speaker coming up is Paulette Regan, who's the Director of Research for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Paulette holds a PhD from the Indigenous Governance Program at the University of Victoria. And she's also the author of Unsettling the Settler Within, Indian Residential Schools, Truth-Telling and Reconciliation in Canada, which was published by UBC Press. Just getting set up with the microphone.
We'll see if it's on. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Awesome.
And how's it in the back there? Does that sound good? All right, Paulette, thanks very much. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here today. I am very blessed to have been born here in Coast Salish territory, and it's lovely to be here in the traditional homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I want to thank the organizers, Lindsay Tripp, and all of the other people who were mentioned, whose names I won't be able to say. But thank you all for this kind invitation, and thank you, Shelley, for starting us off in such a good way. It's been my honor to have known. I've known your dad now for more years than we probably either of us would care to remember in some ways. But thank you so much for your good words. It really grounds us in where I think we need to be. So I'm going to begin by setting a little context about the TRC's vision of reconciliation, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about you as librarians, and I won't go too far down that path because you're the experts in that field, but I will just offer you a few thoughts. And then I'm going to actually bring it, because decolonization, of course, happens at all levels. It happens personal level, political level, institutional level, professional level. So I'm going to then end with a few reflections of my own about reconciliation and how we might frame that. So for over a decade now, I've been humbled and inspired by residential school survivors, their families, and communities, bearing witness to their courage, strength, and resilience as they shared their public testimonies, life stories about their experiences before, during, and after residential school has truly been a life-changing journey for me. With respectful gratitude, I acknowledge that without the individual and collective fortitude and vision of survivors, there would have been no TRC in Canada. Survivors have gifted all of us with their testimonies. They have entrusted us with an ethical responsibility to bear witness to the injustices of the past that are ongoing in the present, thus calling us to action. Answering that call involves making respectful space for Indigenous peoples to reclaim and regenerate their own diverse cultures, histories, laws, and governance systems that come from the land. It involves listening with open minds and humble hearts to the collective knowledge and wisdom of elders and knowledge keepers whose stories about how to establish, repair, and nurture good relationships with each other and the living land can guide us on new pathways of justice and reconciliation. So survivors told the Commission that while they were victims of residential schools, this is not all of who they are. And Shelley, your reflections on your father's journey are a perfect example of this. They are also elders, knowledge keepers, teachers, healthcare workers, social workers, lawyers, and others, and I'm pretty sure there are librarians amongst that list as well, who are leaders in their own communities, professions, and the life of the nation. Survivors across the country told the TRC that they want their children and grandchildren to learn their own cultures, languages, and ways of life. And they want Canadians to learn not only about the history and legacy of residential schools, but about Indigenous history and culture and the rich contributions that Indigenous peoples have made to this country. The reconciliation volume was informed by the teachings of Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers whose concepts, ethics, principles, protocols, and practices of reconciliation are rooted in their knowledge of Indigenous oral history and law. So they told the Commission that, and I'm quoting from the report here, while there was no word for reconciliation in their languages, and there again, Shelley, you mentioned this, they knew many concepts, teachings, laws, ceremonies, protocols, and practices that have been used by their respective nations for millennia to resolve conflicts, repair harms, and restore good relations amongst diverse peoples and with the earth. Canadians have much to learn from the voices, experience, and wisdom of survivors, elders, and traditional knowledge keepers, and much more to learn about reconciliation. Aboriginal peoples have an important contribution to make to reconciliation. Their knowledge systems, oral histories, laws, and connections to the land have vitally informed the reconciliation process to date and are essential to its ongoing progress." End quote. So the Commission concludes that the scope of reconciliation must extend beyond the critical work of documenting the history and addressing the legacy of residential schools, and the Commission calls for a sweeping transformation of settler colonial systems, institutions, and relationships across all levels and sectors of Canadian society. The social, political, economic, cultural, and educational foundations of the country that have oppressed and marginalized Indigenous peoples must be decolonized, restructured, and transformed in concrete ways that recognize, respect, and support Indigenous self-determination. Observing the limitations of state-centric approaches to reconciliation that can ultimately work to replicate rather than to transform colonial relations, the TRC identified the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the appropriate framework for reconciliation in 21st century Canada. Thus, the TRC report lays the foundation for a just and meaningful reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples that is contingent upon the resurgence and regeneration of Indigenous cultures, languages, knowledge systems, oral histories, governance structures, and laws. In conducting its work and in the final report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission placed particular emphasis on education and the leadership role that public education institutions and educators must play in reconciliation, noting that, quote, "Much of the current state of troubled relations between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians is attributable to educational institutions and what they have taught or failed to teach over many generations. Despite this history, or perhaps more correctly because of its potential, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission believes that education is also key to reconciliation. The Commission believes that to be an effective force for reconciliation, curriculum about residential schools must be part of a broader history education that integrates First Nations, Inuit, and Métis voices, perspectives, and experiences, and that builds common ground between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. The education system itself must be transformed into one that rejects the racism embedded in colonial systems of education and treats Aboriginal and Euro-Canadian knowledge systems with equal respect." End quote. So, and of course, as some of you may know, because several of you indicated that you had looked at the calls to action, the TRC report made some specific calls to action with regard to education, including equitable education funding for Indigenous students, mandatory K-12 curriculum on residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal people's historical and contemporary contributions to Canada, funding to post-secondary institutions to educate teachers on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods into classrooms, and funding to Aboriginal schools to utilize Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in classrooms. And so to varying degrees across the country, as we've seen since the TRC finished its work, some of this work has already begun, particularly with regard to K-12 curriculum. And as universities undertake to indigenize their institutions, more Indigenous faculty are being hired and more Indigenous content is being included in courses. But of course, as we all know, there's much, much more that remains to be done. Commission also heard from universities and educators. Over the course of the TRC's lifetime, many universities across the country began to examine their own institutional histories of complicity in supporting the residential school system and in reinforcing colonialism through various professional programs and research activities. And since the release of the calls to action in June 2015, which I can scarcely believe it's already been a year, post-secondary institutions have begun an important dialogue to explore and determine what actions they will undertake to implement the TRC's calls to action. Universities Canada, which represents 97 universities across the country, has established 13 principles on Indigenous education in consultation with Indigenous communities, noting that, quote, higher education offers great potential for reconciliation and a renewed relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. Universities benefit from the presence of Indigenous students and their cultures, making our campuses more open places with wider sources of discovery and knowledge. Mutual respect for different ways of knowing and recognizing the intellectual contributions of Indigenous people is essential to building trust, understanding, and sharing. The cohabitation of Western science and Indigenous knowledge on campuses has the power of opening a dialogue among cultures and enhancing our shared knowledge, end quote. So clearly, much of the ongoing work ahead involves decolonizing universities by making space for Indigenous epistemologies, methodologies, and pedagogies to take their rightful place in curricula, programs, and services throughout post-secondary institutions. Post-secondary library and archives programs must be part of this broader dialogue. The TRC calls for various post-secondary professional programs to ensure that students receive education and training on the history and legacy of residential schools, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, and Indigenous teachings and practices. So the TRC had a vision, a much broader vision of what the education in these professional programs would involve. It needs to go beyond the history and legacy of the residential schools. So this will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. Equally important, those already working in their profession should have opportunities for similar education and training. At the same time, in thinking about practice-based responses to the TRC calls to action, what might librarians as information managers and knowledge facilitators contribute? How can libraries create a decolonizing space for Indigenous knowledge systems and pedagogy and make information and materials in your collections more accessible to Indigenous learners, researchers, and communities?